I am your host, Miss Marple. Let's begin our journey.
I was at my desk, trying to convince the bank statement that we hadn't actually spent that much on out-of-season Brazilian peppercorns, when the doorbell rang. It was 11:10, Tuesday morning in mid-December. The city outside was huddled under a grey slush that looked like used oatmeal, but inside the brownstone, the air was warm, filtered, and currently vibrating with the humming of the elevator. Nero Wolfe was descending from his morning session with the orchids, a ritual that is roughly as flexible as the laws of thermodynamics. I went to the door, checked the view panel, and saw a man who looked like he'd been gift-wrapped by a tailor with a grudge. He was wearing a topcoat that cost more than my car, carrying a cane he didn't need, and possessed a face that suggested he'd just bitten into a lemon and found it lacked sufficient acidity. I opened the door. "Good morning. If you're looking for the mayor, he's at City Hall. If you're looking for a miracle, the line starts behind the red velvet rope." The man didn't blink. "I am Sterling Vane. I assume you are the help. Tell Mr. Wolfe that I am here to prevent a massacre, though of the metaphorical variety." "I'm Archie Goodwin," I said, letting him in because the wind was beginning to bite. "I'm the help that keeps the geniuses from starving." "Mr. Wolfe is just finishing his morning chores. You can wait in the office, but don't touch the globes. He likes his geography exactly where he left it." I led him into the office. Vane didn't sit. He stood by the window, staring out at West 35th Street, as if he were contemplating buying the block just to tear it down. A moment later, the door from the hallway opened, and the mountain moved in. Wolfe navigated the room with his usual ponderous grace, settled into his 500-pound chair, and spent 30 seconds adjusting his blotter before acknowledging our guest existed. "Mr. Vane," Wolfe said, his voice a deep melodic rumble, "you are early. I do not like being early. It suggests a lack of discipline." "I'm in a hurry, Wolfe," Vane snapped, turning around. "And I'm not here for a lecture on punctuality. I'm president of the Gotham Culinary Society. On Thursday night, we hold our annual holiday banquet. It is the country's most prestigious dinner. And someone is going to use it to destroy me." Wolfe leaned back, his interlaced fingers resting on his center of gravity. "A dinner. If you want a menu, talk to Fritz. If you want a bodyguard, talk to the police. I am a private detective. It isn't a physical threat," Vane said, finally sitting in the red leather chair. He leaned forward. "Every year the Society's secret recipe for the consommé de Noël is prepared. It is kept in a locked humidor in my private study. Yesterday I found the humidor open. The recipe was still there, but something else had been added to the box. A single dried sprig of monkshood." Wolfe's eyelids flickered. It was the equivalent of another man jumping out of his skin, monkshood, a charmingly literal threat. "A carnitum. It's more than a threat," Vane said. "It's a message. The person who left it knows that I've been skimming the Society's endowment to cover my losses in the shipping lanes. They're telling me that if I don't resign before the first course is served on Thursday, they'll release the proof to the board. And they'll do it by poisoning the reputation of the Society itself." Wolfe poured a glass of beer from the tray Fritz had brought in, watching the foam with the intensity of a surgeon. "You are an embezzler, Mr. Vane. You are asking me to protect a thief from a blackmailer. I am asking you to protect the sanctity of the Society," Vane countered. "If this breaks, the endowment vanishes, the staff is out on the street, and 50 years of culinary history is flushed. Find the blackmailer, silence them. I'll pay your retainer. 5,000 now, 5,000 when the banquet is over without a scandal." Wolfe took a long, slow sip of his beer. He hates the holiday season, he hates crowds, and he especially hates being used as a shield for a man's financial indiscretions. But $5,000 buys a lot of orchid peat, and the mention of monkshood, a poison named for himself in a way, had pricked his vanity. "Archie," Wolfe said, not looking at me. "Yeah? Get the guest list for this banquet, and tell Fritz that for lunch we shall have the moule marinière. I find I have a sudden appetite for things that hide in shells." I reached for my notebook. The hook was in, even if the bait was a bit rancid. Sterling Vane stood up, looking relieved, but I saw the way Wolfe was staring at the space where the man had been. It wasn't relief Wolfe was feeling, it was the slow, cold calculation of a man who had just realized his own house was about to be part of the menu. The office was no longer the private fortress of a man who preferred the company of orchids to people. It had become a temporary clearinghouse for the egos of the Gotham Culinary Society. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the red leather chair and the supplementary seats I'd pulled from the hallway were occupied by 3 men who looked like they had been born in tuxedos and fed on a diet of pure tradition. Nero Wolfe sat behind his desk, his palms resting flat on the wood, watching them with the heavy, unblinking gaze of a man observing a particularly complex species of beetle. Sterling Vane had returned, looking even more frayed than he had in the morning. He was flanked by his 2 most powerful colleagues, Arthur Penhaligon, a man with silver hair and a voice like dry parchment, who served as the Society's treasurer, and Silas Thorne, a younger, more aggressive board member whose family had built their fortune on industrial bakeries. Thorne sat with his arms crossed, his eyes roaming the office with a proprietary air that I didn't care for. "It is a matter of containment, Mr. Wolfe," Penhaligon was saying, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on his briefcase. "The Society is built on a foundation of absolute discretion. If word gets out that our chairman's private study was breached and that a toxic herb was left as a calling card, our benefactors will flee. The holiday banquet is not merely a meal, it is a theatrical performance of stability. Stability is a delicate thing when it is built on a theft," Wolfe remarked, his voice a low rumble. He didn't look at Penhaligon. He was watching Silas Thorne. "Mr. Thorne, you seem remarkably composed for a man whose association is being threatened with a public scandal." Thorne shrugged, a sharp, practiced movement. "I'm a businessman, Wolfe. I deal in realities, not sentiments. If Vane has been sloppy with the books, that's a board matter. But the monkshood? That's a personal attack. It suggests someone within the inner circle has a flair for the dramatic. I'm here because I want to ensure the banquet goes off without a hitch. My family's name is on the dessert course this year, and your name is also on the list of people who knew the combination to the humidor," I put in, leaning against my desk. I had the Society's bylaws open in front of me. "According to the charter, the 3 of you, Vane, Penhaligon and Thorne, are the only ones with the codes to the chairman's private vault. It's a short list for a big secret. The codes are changed monthly," Vane snapped, "and I changed them myself 3 days ago. Whoever got in didn't use a crowbar. They used a key I didn't know existed." Wolfe shifted his weight, and the chair gave its customary groan of protest. He had traded his beer for a small glass of water, which usually meant he was preparing to be particularly difficult. "A key, or a familiarity with the chairman's habits that borders on the intimate. Mr. Penhaligon, as treasurer, you have been remarkably quiet about Mr. Vane's creative accounting. Did you notice the discrepancies, or were you looking the other way?" Penhaligon's face went a shade of grey that matched the slush outside. I have always trusted Sterling's leadership. The Society's accounts are complex. If there were errors, I assumed they were administrative." "Administrative," Wolfe repeated, the word tasting like copper in his mouth. "A convenient shroud for many sins. And you, Mr. Thorne? You have been pushing for a merger with a national hospitality conglomerate. A scandal involving the current chairman would certainly clear the path for your ambitions, would it not?" Thorne stood up, his eyes narrowing. "I didn't come here to be interrogated by a man who hasn't left his zip code in a decade. We are paying you to find the blackmailer, not to audition for the role of prosecutor. If you can't do the job, we'll find someone who can. You have already found someone who can," Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a register of cold authority that made the room go silent. "But I do not work for the Society. I work for the truth, and current. Sully, the truth is that one of you is a thief, one of you is a liar, and one of you is a coward. I have yet to determine which role belongs to whom. Archie, see the gentlemen to the door. I have no further use for their presence this afternoon." I led them out, enjoying the way Thorne's jaw was working, and the way Vane's hands were shaking as he reached for his hat. When the front door clicked shut, the brownstone felt twice as large and 10 times as quiet. I went back into the office. Wolfe was staring at the space where Vane had been sitting. "Well?" I asked. "Are we taking the case, or did you just want to see how many high-priced suits you could offend in 20 minutes? "The case is already taken, Archie," Wolfe said, his eyes half closing. "The monkshood was not merely a threat, it was a signature. It was chosen because of its name, Wolfsbane. Whoever left it knows me, or at least knows my reputation. They are not just blackmailing Vane, they are inviting me to the table. It is a challenge of the highest order. A challenge, I muttered, grabbing my coat. Great. Every time someone wants to play chess with you, I'm the one who has to walk through the snow. Where do you want me to start? With the cook, Wolf said, picking up his book. Vane mentioned the consomme de Noël. A woman named Madame Genevieve prepares it. She has been with the society for 30 years. If anyone knows the private geography of that kitchen and the men who frequent it, it is she. Go, Archie, and do not be late for dinner. Fritz is preparing a fricandeau of veal, and I will not have the evening ruined by a preoccupation with poisoners. I walked out into the cold, thinking that for a man who claimed to hate drama, Wolf was certainly surrounded by a lot of people who liked the theatre. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of the Gotham Culinary Society, wondering if Madame Genevieve's consommé was as clear as Wolf's logic, or if it was as murky as the motives of the men I'd just shown to the door. The Gotham Culinary Society was housed in a limestone mansion on East 62nd Street that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought the French Revolution had been a minor clerical error. The air inside didn't just smell like food, it smelled like the history of food, heavy with the ghosts of clarified butter, expensive sherry, and the kind of quiet arrogance that only comes with a century of exclusive membership. I bypassed the main dining room, which was a sea of velvet and crystal being polished for the big night, and headed straight for the basement. The kitchen was the size of a small cathedral and twice as hot. In the center of the steam stood Madame Genevieve. She was a woman who appeared to be constructed entirely out of steel wire and flour. She was currently hovering over a copper pot with a look of such intense concentration that I felt like an intruder for merely breathing. "Madame Genevieve?" I said, stepping into the butcher block light. "I am Archie Goodwin. I'm working with Mr. Nero Wolfe." She didn't look up. Wolfe, one who eats like a king and judges like a god. Why is he sending a messenger to my kitchen? If he wants the recipe for the consommé, tell him he must wait for the funeral of the society, which seems to be arriving ahead of schedule. He doesn't want the recipe, I said, leaning against a prep table. He wants to know about the visitors, specifically the ones who have been spending time in Mr. Vane's private study above the pantry. It seems someone left a garnish in his humidor that didn't belong there. She stopped stirring. Her eyes, dark and sharp as peppercorns, finally met mine. The monk should. I smelled it before I saw it. That herb has a cold, metallic scent that has no place in a room dedicated to the palate. It was not a guest who left it, Monsieur Goodwin. It was a ghost. "A ghost with a key?" I asked. "Or a ghost who knows the codes? In this house the walls have ears, but the stoves have memories," she whispered, stepping closer. "For 30 years I have watched the men of the board. Arthur Penhaligon is a paper man. He fears the wind. Silas Thorne is a man of fire. He wants to consume everything. But there was another, a man named Julian Vane, Sterling's brother. He was the true architect of the society's cellar. He died 5 years ago, but his signature was all over that study." "Julian Vane?" I noted the name. I thought Sterling was the only one left. Julian was the one who kept the secrets, she said, her voice dropping. "And he had a protégé, a young man who worked the larder, very talented, very bitter. He disappeared after Julian's death, but lately I have seen things move. A knife out of place, a spice jar turned left. Small things that only Julian's students would do. I thanked her and headed back to the main hall, my brain spinning. I had a dead brother, a bitter protégé, and a board of directors that was currently eating itself alive. I decided to do a little trespassing of my own while the afternoon light was still holding. Vane's study was in a mahogany-heavy cave at the end of a private corridor. It was thick with the smell of old tobacco and the kind of silence that usually suggests something expensive is being hidden. I checked the humidor. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, but the lock was a standard 6-pin tumbler, easy enough for a professional but a joke for someone with an inside track. I looked around the room, checking the rug, the wastebasket and the undersides of the chairs. I found exactly what I was looking for tucked into the crevice of a heavy velvet curtain, a small silver-headed pin with a trace of blue thread still attached. It wasn't much, but in the world of Nero Wolfe, a thread is often the beginning of a noose. I walked back into the brownstone at 6 o'clock. The smell of Fritz's veal was a welcome change from the oppressive elegance of the society. I found Wolf in the office, his eyes closed, his fingers tapping a rhythmic pattern on the arms of his chair. He didn't open his eyes when I sat down. "The kitchen is haunted," I said, tossing the silver pin onto his desk. "According to Madame Genevieve, there's a protégé of a dead Vane brother lurking in the pantry, and I found this in the study. Blue thread. Does that mean anything to a man who spends his life in a yellow vest?" Wolf opened one eye and looked at the pin. Blue thread, color the society's gala livery. It suggests the intruder was not a guest, but someone dressed to blend into the scenery. A waiter, a valet, or perhaps someone who has been wearing the uniform so long they have forgotten they can take it off. "And the protégé?" I asked. "The protégé is a variable," Wolf murmured, "but the monkshood remains the constant. It is nerve poison, Archie. It does not just kill, it paralyzes, which is exactly what is happening to Mr. Vane's board. They are so afraid of the scandal that they are unable to move against the thief in their midst." The doorbell rang, a sharp, insistent sound. I checked the monitor and saw Arthur Penhaligon. He looked like he'd been run over by a very slow, very heavy truck. I let him in, and he practically stumbled into the office. "It's happened again," he gasped, clutching the edge of Wolf's desk. "In the society's wine cellar. A bottle of the 1945 Romani Conti, the one reserved for the keynote toast, has been tampered with. The seal was broken, and inside the crate there was anoth, a sprig of monkshood, and a note. It says the first sip will be the last." Wolf sat up, his face hardening into a mask of pure intellectual fury. "The wine cellar, the sanctity of the society's liquid history, has been violated. This is no longer a matter of embezzlement, Mr. Penhaligon. This is an assault on the very foundations of hospitality." "What do we do?" Penhaligon cried. "We do nothing," Wolf snapped. "Archie, call Saul Panzer. I want him in that bodega tonight. And tell him to bring his corkscrew. I have a feeling the vintage we are looking for is not yet on the rack." I reached for the phone, feeling the tension in the room tighten like a piano wire. The banquet was 48 hours away, and the poison was already starting to seep through the floorboards. As I dialed Saul's number, I looked at the silver pin on the desk. Velvet and venom. It was a hell of a pairing for a holiday dinner. Wednesday morning arrived with a sky the color of a wet sidewalk and a wind that whistled through the window casings of the brownstone like a hungry ghost. Nero Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms, likely telling Alelia Orchid that its petals were a disappointment, while I was at my desk trying to make sense of a blue thread and a dead brother. The Gotham Culinary Society was turning into a puzzle with too many jagged edges, and I was the one who had to go out and get my fingers cut. I spent the first half of the day doing what I call the sidewalk shuffle. I started at the back entrance of the Society's mansion, watching the deliveries. A man can learn a lot by seeing who brings the eggs and who hauls away the trash. I spotted the livery service truck, a high-end outfit that handled the uniforms for the Society's staff. I followed the driver to their warehouse in Long Island City, where I spent 20 minutes and a $10 bill convincing a clerk to let me look at the repair logs. "Blue thread," I said, leaning over the counter. "I'm looking for a jacket that has lost a silver pin and some lining. Probably a waiter's coat, extra long in the sleeves." The clerk chewed a toothpick and flipped through a grease-stained ledger. "Yeah, we had a rush order on a jacket 2 days ago. Picked up by a private messenger, not the usual society driver, a guy named Thomas. Said he was the new larder assistant." Thomas. The name Madame Genevieve had mentioned, the bitter protégé of the late Julian Vane. I had a name, but in a city of 8 million people, a first name is about as useful as a chocolate teapot. I headed back to Manhattan and spent the next 3 hours at a small, dusty bar near the waterfront where the Society's service staff was known to congregate after their shifts. It was a place that smelled of stale beer and old grievances. I found a retired headwaiter named Felix, a man whose spine was permanently curved from 40 years of bowing to people who didn't know the difference between a salad fork and a tire iron. "Julian Vane's boy?" Felix rasped, staring into a glass of cheap rye. "You mean Thomas Thorne, no relation to the industrialist on the board, though he liked to pretend there was. He was Julian's shadow. When Julian died, Thomas expected to be brought into the front of the house. Instead, Sterling Vane fired him for aesthetic inconsistencies. That's rich, coming from a man who skims the soup. Thomas Thorne, I repeated. Where is he now? He's nowhere and everywhere, Felix said with a cynical grin. He's been working the high-end temp circuit. Private parties, gallery openings. He knows how to blend velvet. If he's got a grudge against Sterling, he's got the keys to the kingdom. He spent 5 years memorizing every shortcut in that mansion while he was apprenticing under Julian. I thanked him and headed for a phone booth. I called Saul Panzer, who was currently playing the role of a night watchman in the Society's wine cellar. Saul, I've got a name. Thomas Thorne. He's a temp waiter with a chip on his shoulder the size of a ham. Keep an eye out for anyone who looks like he knows where the light switches are. And Saul, check the basement vents. If he's as good as they say, he isn't walking through the front door. I'm ahead of you, Archie. Saul's voice came through the receiver, calm and steady. I found a grate that's been loosened behind the rack of 29 sauternes. Someone's been using it as a mail slot. I found another sprig of monkshood tucked into the ductwork. And Archie? There was a no. T. It's a seating chart for the banquet. Sterling Vane is marked with a black X. I hung up and caught a cab back to 35th Street. By the time I walked into the office, the lights were low and Wolf was sitting in his chair, staring at the silver pin, as if he expected it to start testifying. I laid out what I'd found, the livery repair, the identity of the protégé, and the X on the seating chart. Wolf didn't blink. Thomas Thorne, a man who shares a name with a board member but has the blood of a servant, a man who was discarded by the aesthetic standards of a thief. It is a classic recipe for retribution, Archie, but it is too simple. Simple? I asked, sitting at my desk. The guy is literally leaving his name in the ducks. He's got the motive, the access, and the thread. What more do you want? A signed confession, a sample of the poison? I want the logic to hold, Wolf murmured. If Thomas Thorne is the blackmailer, why would he leave a thread in the study? A man trained by Julian Vane, a man who understands the memories of the stoves, would not be so careless. He is not the chef, he is the ingredient. Someone else is stirring the pot. So you think Silas Thorne or Penhaligon is using the kid? I think, Wolf said, standing up with a groan that seemed to come from the floorboards, that the Gotham Culinary Society is about to discover that the most dangerous thing in a kitchen is not the poison, but the person who decides who gets to eat. Archie led Sterling Vane. Tell him the banquet will proceed as planned, but tell him that if he wants to survive the first course, he must invite 4 additional guests. Myself, you, Saul, and a man whose name I shall provide shortly. You're going to a banquet? I asked, my jaw nearly hitting the blotter. In a tuxedo? In a crowd? I am going to a crime scene, Archie, Wolf said, walking toward the door, and I expect the service to be impeccable. Tell Fritz to prepare my evening clothes. They will need to be aired. It has been some time. I watched him go, wondering if the world was coming to an end. Nero Wolfe in a tuxedo was a sight that usually preceded a major earthquake. As I reached for the phone to call Vane, I looked at the silver pin. The blue thread was starting to look less like a clue and more like a fuse. And tomorrow night, it was all going to blow. Wednesday morning arrived with a sky the colour of a wet sidewalk and a wind that whistled through the window casings of the brownstone like a hungry ghost. Nero Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms, likely telling a Laelia orchid that its petals were a disappointment, while I was at my desk trying to make sense of a blue thread and a dead brother. The Gotham Culinary Society was turning into a puzzle with too many jagged edges, and I was the one who had to go out and get my fingers cut. I spent the first half of the day doing what I call the sidewalk shuffle. I started at the back entrance of the Society's manse. Watching the deliveries. A man can learn a lot by seeing who brings the eggs and who hauls away the trash. I spotted the livery service truck, a high-end outfit that handled the uniforms for the Society's staff. I followed the driver to their warehouse in Long Island City, where I spent 20 minutes and a $10 bill convincing a clerk to let me look at the repair logs. Blue thread, I said, leaning over the counter. I'm looking for a jacket that has lost a silver pin and some lining, probably a waiter's coat, extra long in the sleeves. The clerk chewed a toothpick and flipped through a grease-stained ledger. Yeah, We had a rush order on a jacket 2 days ago, picked up by a private messenger, not the usual society driver. A guy named Thomas said he was the new larder assistant. Thomas, the name Madame Genevieve had mentioned, the bitter protégé of the late Julian Vane. I had a name, but in a city of 8 million people, a first name is about as useful as a chocolate teapot. I headed back to Manhattan and spent the next 3 hours at a small, dusty bar near the waterfront, where the society's service staff was known to congregate after their shifts. It was a place that smelled of stale beer and old grievances. I found a retired headwaiter named Felix, a man whose spine was permanently curved from 40 years of bowing to people who didn't know the difference between a salad fork and a tire iron. "Julian Vane's boy?" Felix rasped, staring into a glass of cheap rye. "You mean Thomas Thorne? No relation to the industrialist on the board, though he liked to pretend there was. He was Julian's shadow. When Julian died, Thomas expected to be brought into the front of the house. Instead, Sterling Vane fired him for aesthetic inconsistencies. That's rich, coming from a man who skims the soup. Thomas Thorne, I repeated. Where is he now? He's nowhere and everywhere, Felix said with a cynical grin. He's been working the high-end temp circuit. Private parties, gallery openings. He knows how to blend in velvet. If he's got a grudge against Sterling, he's got the keys to the kingdom. He spent 5 years memorizing every shortcut in that mansion while he was apprenticing under Julian. I thanked him and headed for a phone booth. I called Saul Panzer, who was currently playing the role of a night watchman in the society's wine cellar. "Saul, I've got a name, Thomas Thorne. He's a temp waiter with a chip on his shoulder the size of a ham. Keep an eye out for anyone who looks like he knows where the light switches are. And Saul, check the basement vents. If he's as good as they say, he isn't walking through the front door." "I'm ahead of you, Archie," Saul's voice came through the receiver, calm and steady. "I found a grate that's been loosened behind the rack of 29 sauternes. Someone's been using it as a mail slot. I found another sprig of monkshood tucked into the ductwork. And Archie, there was a note. It's a seating chart for the B. Inquet. Sterling Vane is marked with a black X. I hung up and caught a cab back to 35th Street. By the time I walked into the office, the lights were low, and Wolf was sitting in his chair staring at the silver pin as if he expected it to start testifying. I laid out what I'd found, the livery repair, the identity of the protégé, and the X on the seating chart. Wolf didn't blink. Thomas Thorne. A man who shares a name with a board member but has the blood of a servant. A man who was discarded by the aesthetic standards of a thief. It is a classic recipe for retribution, Archie. But it is too simple. Simple? I asked, sitting at my desk. The guy is literally leaving his name in the ducks. He's got the motive, the access, and the thread. What more do you want? A signed confession and a sample of the poison? I want the logic to hold, Wolf murmured. If Thomas Thorne is the blackmailer, why would he leave a thread in the study? A man trained by Julian Vane, a man who understands the memories of the stoves, would not be so careless. He is not the chef, he is the ingredient. Someone else is stirring the pot. So you think Silas Thorne or Penhaligon is using the kid? I think, Wolf said, standing up with a groan that seemed to come from the floorboards, that the Gotham Culinary Society is about to discover that the most dangerous thing in a kitchen is not the poison, but the person who decides who gets to eat. Archie called Sterling Vane. Tell him the Inquet will proceed as planned. But tell him that if he wants to survive the first course, he must invite 4 additional guests, myself, you, Saul, and a man whose name I shall provide shortly. You're going to a banquet? I asked, my jaw nearly hitting the blotter. In a tuxedo? In a crowd? I am going to a crime scene, Archie, Wolf said, walking toward the door, and I expect the service to be impeccable. Tell Fritz to prepare my evening clothes. They will need to be aired. It has been some time. I watched him go, wondering if the world was coming to an end. Nero Wolfe in a tuxedo was a sight that usually preceded a major earthquake. As I reached for the phone to call Vane, I looked at the silver pin. The blue thread was starting to look less like a clue and more like a fuse, and tomorrow night it was all going to blow. The breach in Brownstone's basement occurred at 3:14 Thursday morning while the rest of the world was pretending to sleep. I know the time because I don't just sleep. I remain on a low-frequency alert, and the subtle click of the deadbolt on the service entrance is a sound that my brain categorizes under immediate attention required. I was out of bed and into my robe with my Colt in my hand before the intruder had even cleared the coat rack in the hallway. I didn't turn on the lights. I know the geography of the brownstone better than I know the back of my own hand, and I navigated the stairs like a shadow. I expected a professional, maybe Thomas, to horn coming to reclaim his silver pin, but what I found in the kitchen was far more disturbing. The service door was standing open, letting in a draught of freezing New York air, and standing in the center of the room was Madame Genevieve. She wasn't stealing anything. She was staring at the herb locker with an expression that made my skin crawl. "Madam," I said, my voice low and steady, "it's a little early for cooking, and we usually prefer people to use the bell." She didn't jump. She turned slowly, her face pale in the moonlight filtering through the window. "Monsieur Goodwin, I had to come. The wine cellar, it was not enough for them. Tonight they came for the salt." "Who came for the salt?" I asked, lowering the gun, but not putting it away. "The ones who want the society to bleed," she whispered. "I found a packet in my locker tonight. It was marked with the seal of Nero Wolfe. Inside was a white powder." "Not salt, monsieur, arsenic. They are not just blackmailing Sterling Vane anymore. They are setting the stage for a massacre, and they are using your master's name to do it." I took the packet from her shaking hand. It was a small vellum envelope, and she was right. It bore a crude but recognizable imitation of Wolfe's personal crest. I led her into the office, flipped on a single desk lamp, and went to wake the mountain. Wolfe emerged 10 minutes later, wrapped in a dressing gown the color of an angry sunset. He didn't look tired, he looked offended. He sat at his desk, ignored Madame Genevieve for a full minute while he examined the envelope, and then let out a sigh that seemed to vibrate the floorboards. "A clumsy provocation," Wolfe murmured. "To suggest that I would use arsenic, a pedestrian, tasteless substance, is an insult to my intelligence, and leave it in a kitchen locker. It lacks the elegance of the monk should. Elegant or not, it's a setup," I said. "If that banquet ends with 100 dead socialites and your seal on the poison, we aren't going to be worried about aesthetic inconsistencies. We're going to be worried about the electric chair." Wolfe looked at Madame Genevieve. "You risked a great deal to bring this here, madame. Why?" "Because you are the only one who truly eats," she said simply. "The others, they consume. They use food for power, for status, for lies. You use it for life. I will not have my kitchen turned into a graveyard for the sake of men like Sterling Vane." Wolfe nodded slowly. It was the highest compliment he could pay her. "Archie, call Saul. If he is still in the society's cellar, tell him to abandon his post. The threat has migrated, and call Saul's contact at the livery service again. I want to know who ordered the additional uniforms for tonight's banquet, not the ones for the staff, the ones for the guests." "Uniforms for the guests?" I asked. "The Gotham Culinary Society has a tradition," Wolfe said, his eyes turning into slits. "The final course is served in total darkness, a sensory deprivation exercise. The servers wear hooded robes. It is the perfect environment for a substitution. Someone is planning to play the part of a waiter, Archie, and they are planning to do it while wearing my reputation as a mask." I spent the next 4 hours on the phone and moving. Saul reported that the cellar was empty, but he had found something the intruder had missed. A second silver pin, this one stuck into the cork of the tampered Romani Conti. It was a breadcrumb trail designed to lead us exactly where the killer wanted us to go. By 8 a.m., I had the information from the livery. 3 hooded robes had been delivered to a private address in Chelsea, the residence of Arthur Penhaligon. The man of paper was starting to look like he had some very sharp edges. But when I checked the address, the apartment was empty and the neighbor said Mr. Penhaligon hadn't been home in 2 days. I returned to the brownstone to find Wolfe in the dining room, eating his breakfast in a silence so thick it was practically a solid. He didn't speak until he had finished his second egg. "The net is cast, Archie," he said, wiping his lips. "The blackmailer is no longer Thomas Thorne. He was the distraction. The bitter boy used to draw our eyes to the pantry. The architect of this discord is someone who understands that the only way to truly destroy a man like Sterling Vane is to destroy the thing he loves most, the society itself." "So we're still going to the banquet?" I asked. "We are going to "Oh, the banquet," Wolf said, standing up. "But we are not guests. We are going as the jury. Tell Fritz to prepare the car. And Archie, make sure your colt is clean. I suspect the sensory deprivation course will be quite revealing." I watched him walk toward the elevator, his shoulders set with a grim purpose. Breaking the cellar and kitchen had turned a professional matter into a personal crusade. As I went to the gun cabinet, I looked at the vellum envelope on the desk. Arsenic and monkshood. It was a bitter menu. And tonight, we were going to find out who was footing the bill. The transition from the sanctuary of the brownstone to the cold, echoing marble of the Gotham Culinary Society was a journey from order into calculated chaos. By 6 o'clock Thursday night, the mansion was a hive of frantic activity. Florists were hauling in towering arrangements of winter lilies that smelled like a high-class funeral, and waiters in blue and gold livery were moving with the synchronized precision of a clockwork mechanism. I stood in the foyer, adjusting the silk lapels of my tuxedo and feeling the reassuring weight of my shoulder holster. Nero Wolfe was still in the car, waiting for the precise moment when his arrival would cause the maximum amount of friction. I had spent the last 2 hours doing a final sweep with Saul Panzer. We had checked every bottle in the service bar and every tureen in the kitchen. Madame Genevieve was there, her face a mask of grim determination as she personally oversaw the simmering of the consommé de Noël. She didn't speak to me, but she handed me a small piece of folded parchment she had found tucked into the knife rack. It was a list of names, and Sterling Vane's was on top, followed by Arthur Penhaligon. Silas Thorne's name had been crossed with a single violent stroke of black ink. "The architect is already in the house," I whispered to Saul as we met near the service elevator. "He's not coming for the money anymore. He's coming to finish the poem." "I've got eyes on Penhaligon," Saul replied, leaning against the wood paneling. "He's in the library, drinking heavily. He looks like a man who's waiting for a curtain to fall. But Thorne is the one that worries me, Archie. He's been in the kitchen 3 times, checking the temperature of the ovens. He's acting like he owns the place, even with the scandal hanging over Vane's head." The front doors swung open, and the mountain arrived. Nero Wolfe stepped into the foyer, looking like a displaced emperor in his custom-tailored evening clothes. He didn't look at the crystal chandeliers or the sea of velvet. He looked at the staff. His eyes raked over the waiters, searching for the aesthetic inconsistency that would reveal Thomas Thorne. He found nothing but perfection, which in Wolfe's world is often the most suspicious thing of all. Sterling Vane hurried toward us, his face the color of bad parchment. "Wolfe, thank God. The board is meeting in the private dining room. Rees been another note. It was pinned to the keynote speaker's podium. It says, 'The final settlement is due before the lights come back on.'" Wolfe ignored the panic and steered Vane toward a quiet corner. "The settlement is already being paid, Mr. Vane. Your reputation is the currency. Now take us to the private dining room. I wish to speak with Mr. Penhaligon and Mr. Thorne before the other guests arrive. And bring the note." We moved into the inner sanctum, a room draped in heavy crimson drapes and lit by a single massive silver candelabra. Arthur Penhaligon was there, clutching a glass of sherry with both hands. Silas Thorne stood by the fireplace, looking into the flames with a cold, predatory smile. The tension in the room was so thick you could have served it on a platter. "Gentlemen," Wolfe began, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to still the flickering candles, "we are here to discuss a matter of poisonous intent. Not merely the monkshood in the humidor or the arsenic in the kitchen, but the poison of ambition that has turned this society into a cage. Mr. Penhaligon, you have been remarkably agile for a man of paper. Your apartment is empty, your robes have been delivered, and your ledger is currently in the hands of a man I trust. Do you wish to explain why the Society's endowment has been diverted into a private holding company in your name?" Penhaligon's glass hit the floor, shattering into 1,000 diamonds. I was trying to save it. Vine was bleeding us dry. I had to protect the assets. By stealing them?" Thorne laughed, stepping away from the fire. "How noble of you, Arthur. I suppose the blackmail was your idea too. A way to force Sterling out so you could restructure the society into your own private club. The blackmail was a collaborative effort, Wolf interrupted, his eyes shifting to Thorn. But the monkshood was a personal touch. It was a signature that pointed to a ghost, Thomas Thorn. Your cousin, Silas, the boy you helped Sterling Vane discard 5 years ago, so there would be no rival for your family's industrial bakery contracts. You used Thomas to plant the herbs and the notes, promising him a return to the society he loved, while all the time you intended to use the scandal to force a merger that would make you a millionaire 10 times over. Thorn's smile didn't falter. An interesting theory, Wolf, but where is your proof? Thomas is gone. The robes are just fabric, and the banquet is starting in 5 minutes. Unless you plan to stop 100 of the city's most influential people from eating their dinner, I suggest you take your seat and keep your mouth shut. Wolf didn't answer. He looked at the clock on the mantel. The proof, Mr. Thorn, is not in the library or the cellar. It is a sensory deprivation course. You see, when the lights go out, a man's true nature is often revealed by what he reaches for in the dark. Archie, the doors. It is time for the guests to enter. The architect H. has finished his work, and now the jury must take their places. As the first guests began to filter into the main hall, I looked at the 3 men on the board. They were all trapped in a web of their own making, and the first course hadn't even been served. The banquet was no longer a celebration, it was a trap, and Nero Wolfe was the one holding the trigger. The main banquet hall was a cavern of shimmering gold and flickering candlelight, a cathedral dedicated to the worship of the palate. 100 of New York's most influential figures sat at long mahogany tables, their voices a low, cultured hum that masked the jagged nerves of the men at the head table. Nero Wolfe sat in a reinforced chair at the center of the dais, a mountain of black silk and white linen, looking out over the assembly with the detached air of a judge, watching a play he had already reviewed. I was positioned 10 feet behind him, my back to a velvet curtain, watching the shadows for any movement that didn't belong to the choreography of the service. Sterling Vane, Arthur Penhaligon, and Silas Thorn sat in a row to Wolfe's left. They were the 3 pillars of the society, but tonight they looked like 3 men waiting for a trapdoor to open. The consommé de Noël had been served and cleared without incident, but the tension in the room hadn't dissipated, it had merely condensed. The theatre of the meal, Wolfe murmured, loud enough only for the board members and myself to hear. It provides such a comfort. Audible mask for the predatory heart. Do you disagree, Mr. Thorn? You have built a fortune on the mass production of bread, yet you seek the singular prestige of a secret recipe, a contradiction that usually ends in indigestion. Thorn didn't look at him. He was staring at the waiters, who were now preparing the room for the sensory deprivation course. The chandeliers were being dimmed by degrees, the golden light receding like a tide, leaving only the tiny pinprick flames of the table candles. This was the tradition, the final savory course served in absolute darkness, delivered by hooded servers to ensure the guests focused entirely on the flavor and the scent. "It is time," Penhaligon whispered, his voice cracking. "The lights. We shouldn't do it. Not tonight." "On the contrary," Wolfe said, his voice a smooth, cold chime in the deepening gloom. "Tonight is the only night it matters. Archie, the signal." I stepped to the side of the room and gave a short, sharp nod to Saul Panzer, who was stationed near the main fuse box. A second later the room plunged into total, suffocating darkness. The low hum of conversation vanished instantly, replaced by the collective intake of 100 breaths. In the silence, the sound of the service doors opening was like the cocking of a pistol. Through my specialized goggles, a little piece of insurance I'd picked up from a contact at the Navy Yard, the room turned into a ghostly green landscape. I saw the hooded servers emerge, 20 of them, moving with absolute silence in their heavy robes. They fanned out across the room, each carrying a silver cloche, but there was a 21st figure. He didn't come from the kitchen. He emerged from the shadows of the library balcony, moving toward the head table with a precision that suggested he didn't need light to find his target. "Thomas Thorn," I whispered into the lapel microphone, connected to Wolfe's hearing aid. "He's at the dais." Moving behind Sterling Vane, the figure reached the chairman's chair. I saw a hand emerge from the heavy blue sleeve of the robe, a hand holding a small, silver-headed pin and a sprig of the dark, twisted monkshood. But as he leaned forward to plant the final signature of his revenge, Wolf's hand shot out with a speed that belied his bulk. He didn't grab the man, he grabbed the cloche on the table and slammed it down over the intruder's hand, trapping the poison and the evidence against the mahogany. "Lights," Wolf barked. The chandeliers erupted into blinding brilliance. Guests gasped, squinting at the sudden glare. On the dais, the hooded figure struggled, but I was over the table in a second, my Colt leveled at his chest. I reached up and ripped the hood away. It was Thomas Thorne, the bitter protégé, his face a contorted mask of fury. But he wasn't looking at Wolf. He was looking at Silas Thorne. "You said he'd be dead," Thomas screamed, his voice echoing through the silent hall. "You said the soup was the way. You used me Oh, get the keys. You used me to plant the notes. And now you're sitting there like a king." Silas Thorne stood up, his face a mask of white marble. "I don't know this man. He's a lunatic, a discarded servant. He is your cousin, Silas," Wolf said, his voice filling the room with the weight of a physical blow, "and he is the only witness who can describe how you orchestrated the embezzlement of the Society's funds through Arthur Penhaligon, using Thomas as your shadow to ensure the blame fell on Sterling Vane. You didn't want the Society to survive, you wanted it to fail so you could strip its assets for your industrial empire. The monkshood wasn't his idea, it was yours. A literary touch for a man you considered a puppet." The guests were standing now, a sea of bewildered silk and wool. Sterling Vane looked like he had aged 20 years in 20 seconds. Penhaligon had slumped into his chair, his head in his hands. "You have no proof," Silas Thorne hissed, though his eyes were darting toward the exits where Saul and the Society's security were already standing. "The proof," Wolf said, lifting the silver cloche to reveal the trapped sprig of monkshood and a small, leather-bound ledger Thomas had been carrying under his robe, "is in the accounting. Thomas Thorne kept his own record of your instructions, Silas. A servant's insurance policy. He didn't trust you any more than you trusted him." Wolf turned to the assembly, his gaze raking over New York's elite. "Gentlemen, Ladi." "I apologize for the interruption. The final course has been cancelled. It appears the chef's secret was a lack of conscience, and the price of the meal was far too high." I took Thomas by the arm and led him toward the door, where the police were already waiting. The architect of discord had finally been unmasked, and the Gotham Culinary Society was left with a very bitter taste in its mouth. Era Wolf didn't look at the crowd. He looked at his watch. "Archie," he said, standing with the slow dignity of a retreating glacier. "The car. I find I have a profound need for a meal that has not been touched by the hands of an industrialist." The aftermath in the banquet hall was a study in high society collapse. While the police, led by a particularly grumpy Inspector Kramer who had been pulled away from his own dinner, bundled Silas Thorne and his cousin Thomas into the waiting squad cars, the elite of New York stood around their mahogany tables, looking like they'd just discovered the caviar was made of buckshot. Arthur Penhaligon had been led away in a state of catatonic shock, and Sterling Vane was left standing alone on the dais, the chairman of a society that had just seen its soul dissected in front of a live audience. Wolf didn't wait for applause or apology. He navigated the exit with a speed that suggested the air in the mansion had become toxic to his lungs. By the time I had settled the logistical details with Kramer and made sure Madame Genevieve was safely headed home, Wolf was already in the back of the car, staring out at the mid-December slush with an expression of profound boredom. The drive back to 35th Street was conducted in a silence that was almost musical. It wasn't until we were back inside the brownstone, the front door bolted and the city's treachery locked on the other side, that Wolf finally spoke. He shed his evening coat as if it were a suit of armor that had grown too heavy for the wearer. "Archie," he said, heading straight for the office. "Is the beer cold?" "Ice cold and waiting for a hero," I said, following him. "Though, if you're looking for a medal, I think Vane is too busy liquidating his assets to send one. We got the check, by the way." Kramer made sure the retainer was honored before the forensic accountants moved in. Wolf settled into his chair, the 500-pound throne that was the only place in the world where he truly felt in control. He poured a glass of beer, watching the foam rise with the same intensity he'd used to unmask a killer. "The Gotham Culinary Society," Wolf murmured, the name tasting like ash. A collection of men who believed that the prestige of a recipe could mask the rot of a soul. They treated hospitality as a weapon, Archie. It is a fundamental perversion of the human condition. Well, Silas Thorne is going to have a lot of time to think about his soul in Sing Sing, I said, sitting at my desk and opening the ledger. He was the one who really stirred the pot. Usen. Gee. The kid's resentment to frame vain, all while Penhaligon was bleeding the endowment dry. It was a hell of a three-way stretch, Wolf. How did you know the darkness would be the trigger? Because a man like Silas Thorne cannot resist the theatre of his own superiority, Wolf responded. He needed to be there. He needed to witness the moment of Sterling Vane's public destruction. In the light, he could play the role of the concerned board member. But in the dark, he believed he was invisible. He didn't realize that in the dark, we are all reduced to our actions. And the monkshood? I asked. Wolfsbane. It was a nice touch, even if it was a bit on the nose. It was a provocation designed by a man who understands the power of a name, Wolf said. Silas knew that by referencing me he would draw me in. He wanted a witness to his genius. He wanted the great Nero Wolfe to be the one who stood by while the society fell. It was an intellectual vanity that proved to be his undoing. He assumed I would be limited by the same rules of aesthetic consistency that governed his own life. I started typing reports, rhythmic clicking of keys filling the room. It was a familiar sound, the final course of every case we take. We'd saved the chairman's life, but we'd destroyed his world. In the world of Nero Wolfe, that's usually considered a fair trade for the truth. You know, I said, pausing over the keys, Madame Genevieve was the real hero of the piece. If she hadn't walked through that snow to bring us the arsenic, we might still be sitting at that table wondering why the coffee tasted like almonds. Madame Genevieve is a woman of the kitchen, Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a register of genuine respect. She understands that preserving food is preserving life. She did not act for the society or for Vane. She acted for the integrity of the stove. It is a motivation I find entirely beyond reproach. The doorbell rang, but I didn't get up. It was probably the press or a late-night delivery of a subpoena, and at 1 a.m., the brownstone was officially closed for business. I looked at Wolfe, who had already picked up a book on Mediterranean history. The holiday banquet intrigue was being filed away under human folly, and the mountain was already retreating back into his private world of words and orchids. Archie, Wolfe said, not looking up from the page. Yeah, tomorrow, tell Fritz we shall have the cassoulet. And tell him the salt is to be handled with the utmost reverence. I have had enough seasoned lies for 1 year. You got it, I said, finishing the last paragraph. Cassoulet and sincerity. I'll put it on the menu. I turned off the desk lamp, leaving the office in the soft, warm glow of the fire. The city outside was still cold and grey, but inside, the order had been restored. We had been to a banquet, we had unmasked a ghost, and we had come home to the only place where the service was truly impeccable. The following morning, the sun attempted to penetrate the New York gloom, succeeding only in turning the slush on West 35th Street into a glistening, treacherous grey. Inside the brownstone, the world had settled back into its proper rotation. The elevator had already made its ceremonial trip to the roof, carrying Nero Wolfe to his 2-hour tryst with 10,000 orchids, and the air in the office was no longer thick with the scent of lilies and high society desperation. It smelled of floor wax, old books, and the faint, comforting aroma of Fritz Brenner's sourdough starter. I was at my desk, finishing the final dictated report for the Gotham Culinary Society, or what was left of it. In the world of Nero Wolfe, a case isn't truly over until the bank deposit is verified and the narrative is committed to paper with the proper margins. I had just finished a paragraph describing Silas Thorne's face when the lights came on, which was a highlight of my week, when the phone rang. It was a reporter from the Gazette looking for a quote. I told him that Mr. Wolfe was currently engaged in a deep-seated philosophical discussion with a dendrobium, and that my only comment was that the soup had been excellent until the politics arrived. At 11 o'clock sharp, the elevator hummed, and the master of the house emerged. He didn't look like a man who had spent the previous evening unmasking an embezzler and a poisoner. He looked like a man who was deeply concerned about a minor infestation of thrips. He navigated the room, settled into his 500-pound chair, and spent several minutes adjusting his blotter with the precision of a master mason. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice a melodic rumble. Is the correspondence cleared? The desk is as clean as a whistle, I told him, spinning the final report around so he could see it. The check from the Society's trustees has cleared, despite the fact that their chairman is currently hiding in a sanitarium in Connecticut, and their treasurer is helping the district attorney with his spelling. We're officially paid in full for services rendered, including the tuxedo rental and the wear and tear on my nervous system. Wolf made a sound of mild acknowledgement, a grunt that passed for a cheer in his lexicon. He poured a glass of beer, watching the foam rise to the rim with the same intensity he'd used to watch Thomas Thorne in the dark. The Gotham Culinary Society, Wolf murmured, the name sounding like a heavy dish that hadn't quite agreed with him. They sought to institutionalize a passion, Archie. They believed that by creating a board of directors and a set of secret recipes, they could capture the essence of hospitality. They failed to realize that a committee cannot legislate sincerity. Well, Silas Thorne tried to legislate it with a sprig of monkshood, I said, and look where it got him. He's going to be eating out of a tin tray for the next decade. Do you think the society will actually survive the scandal? Immaterial, Wolf said, his eyes half closing. An institution that can be destroyed by the truth was already hollow. They traded the integrity of the kitchen for the prestige of the parlor. They forgot the fundamental lesson that Madame Genevieve understands instinctively, that the salt is the soul of the meal, and if the salt has lost its savor, the banquet is merely a funeral with better seating. Fritz appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray of snacks, tiny, perfectly formed watercress sandwiches. He looked at Wolf, then at me, and I saw the tension that had been hanging over his shoulders since the violation of the kitchen finally dissipated. The herb locker was safe, the arsenic was in a police evidence locker, and the home's hierarchy was restored. The cassoulet for lunch, Mr. Wolf, Fritz said, his voice brimming with professional pride. It is resting. I have used the beans from the batch you approved last month. Thank you, Fritz, Wolf said, his voice dropping into a register of genuine respect. And the salt? It is handled with reverence, monsieur, Fritz said with a slight bow. As Fritz retreated to his domain, Wolf took a slow sip of his beer. He looked out at the grey New York skyline and sighed, a sound of profound, mountain-like satisfaction. The holiday banquet intrigue was being filed away under human folly, and the mountain was already retreating back into his private world of words and orchids. You know, I said, leaning back and putting my feet up on the edge of the desk, a move Wolf detests but tolerates when we've just closed a case. Silas Thorne was right about one thing. In the dark, people do show their true nature. He thought he was invisible, but he was the only one in the room who didn't realize that your eyes work better when the lights are off. His vanity was his blindfold, Wolf remarked, picking up a book on the history of the Mediterranean. He assumed that because I do not frequent their ballrooms, I do not understand their motivations. He forgot that the same appetites that drive a man to a banquet drive him to a crime. It is merely a matter of what he is willing to pay for the privilege of the first course. I turned off the desk lamp, leaving the office in the soft, warm glow of the fire. The city outside was still cold and grey, but inside the order had been restored. We had been to a banquet, we had unmasked a ghost, and we had come home to the only place where the service was truly impeccable. Archie, Wolf said, not looking up from his page, remind me to never accept a case involving a culinary society again. I find their lack of seasoning to be exhausting. You got it, I said, finishing the last paragraph of the report. I'll put it on the list right under blackmailers and people who like well-done steak.